Hey everyone, Andrea Walford here. Welcome to another video in my card making tutorials for beginners series. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I created this Just Saying Hello card featuring Stampin' Up's Tasteful Touches stamp set. Now, as part of this video, I'm going to show you how to step up a card by adding layers inside and out, and I'm also going to show you two different techniques. We're going to be using fussy cutting, and I'm going to show you how you can use ink blending to add color to an outline image. So let's start by going over the supplies that we're going to be using to create this card. First off, my card base is going to be made out of Melon Mambo cardstock. This is a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch card, and it's landscape orientation, and it's a side fold. So you can see it opens like this. I also have 2 pieces of Whisper White cardstock that are cut to 3 7/8 of an inch by 5 1/8 of an inch, and then I have 2 pieces of basic black cardstock that are going to be my mats, and these are 4 by 5 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to stamp on these panels, then each one's going to be matted onto a black cardstock piece and then put on the front and inside of my card. Now I also have here a scrap piece of Whisper White cardstock. This is going to be for our stamping and fussy cutting. The only embellishment I'm going to be using are these clear rhinestones. This is one of my favorite embellishments, and an embellishment I recommend that all beginning stampers and card makers get. Now the stamp set itself, as I mentioned, is Tasteful Touches, and I'm going to be using the flower image, the branch image, and the Just Saying Hello image. So this is a cling stamp set, meaning it's out of rubber, made out of rubber, mounted to cling foam. So you need to mount it to acrylic blocks. And of course, you want to make sure that the acrylic blocks you have are as close in size to the stamp as you can possibly get. So the blocks that I'm using for all of these are Stampin' Up's D block. Now the inks that we're going to be using are Granny Apple Green, Flirty Flamingo, Melon Mambo, and Mango Melody. And then the black ink that I like to work with is this Memento Tuxedo Black. So that's going to be what I'm going to stamp my greeting in. Now the adhesives we're going to be using are this Tombow Mono Multi-Liquid Glue. And I've got here some dimensional foam called Stampin' Dimensionals. Now this adhesive here is not an essential, but it's something that I use pretty much every time I'm making cards. And this is Herma Dotto. Basically, it's a repositionable adhesive. So I like to use it to hold my cardstock in pieces in place on my grid paper when I'm stamping. Now, whenever I use a liquid adhesive or that repositionable Dotto adhesive, I always like to keep an adhesive eraser here because it's perfect for removing stray bits of adhesive from your projects or from your grid paper if you need to. Now the tools, we're going to need a pencil and a ruler. I always like to work with a see-through grid ruler. This one's 3 by 12. Doesn't much matter what size you get, you just want to make sure that it's wider than the widest part of your card. I also have here fine tip scissors. Paper snips, I'm going to be using these for fussy cutting. I've got fine tip craft tweezers. I've got a fine eraser, white eraser. This is the Tombow Mono Zero. I like this one because it's small and it gets into small places easily. For our ink blending technique, I'm going to be using these makeup blending brushes, and I bought these on Amazon, and I'll make sure that I include the link so you know exactly which set I got. And I got brushes that were part of a set of 10. So you can see here there's a whole bunch of different sizes and shapes of brushes, but you'll see that when I link to the product that I bought for these. And these are the 2 that I'm going to be using. I have my baby wipes. This is my preferred method of cleaning my stamps. I just find it quick, easy, inexpensive, and I always like to have one out and ready to go when I'm stamping. I always work on grid paper, and I love Stampin' Up's grid paper because it has ruler markings. One side is inches. If you prefer to work in centimeters, you just flip it over to the other side. And I use this for all sorts of different things, and as I use it, I'll talk to you about it during the video. And then finally, I like to work on this self-healing cutting mat. That's my base surface because it's flat, it's smooth, it allows me to have a firm surface to work on, and I get a nice, crisp, even impression when I'm stamping. So that's all the supplies we're going to be using. Let's move on to making our card. So we're going to start off by stamping on our Whisper White cardstock pieces. Now one of these pieces is going to be at the front of my card, and then the other piece is going to be on the inside of my card. Now I'm going to start by taking my repositionable adhesive and putting just a little bit on my grid paper. And this is essentially to keep my cardstock in place as I'm stamping. Now the first image I'm going to stamp is my stem image, you can see here, and I'm going to be stamping it in Granny Apple Green Classic ink. So I'm going to ink up my stamp by tapping it up and down on my ink pad. And then, see, I see a little fluff here. I'm just grabbing that off. I always like to flip my stamp over, take a quick look, make sure that there's no fluffs, that it's all inked. And then I'm going to take this and I'm going to ink it along the right side of my cardstock piece. And I'm going to apply light pressure and then lift. So as you can see, my cardstock is in landscape orientation. So this is a 3 7/8 by 5 1/8 here, and I'm stamping along the right. Now I'm going to ink my stamp again. And I'm going to stamp along the bottom this time. And I want the stems to be fairly close together, but not overlapping, because they're going to be covered by the flower. Press and lift, and you can see I have my vines. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing for my second piece of cardstock. So as you can see here, I have both pieces of cardstock stamped. So I'm going to set one aside for the inside because we're not going to need that, and now we're going to stamp our greeting. Now when you're freehand stamping, especially when you're working with cling stamps, it can be a little bit tricky. So the first tip that I want to share with you is, I'm just going to take this off my block. So the first thing I do whenever I am mounting my stamp and I'm freehand stamping, so I'm not using any kind of a stamp positioning tool, I take a look at an element of my greeting. So in this case, I'm going to look at the largest word, which is saying. And I'm going to align it with one of the lines on my grid paper. So I'm basically using, actually let me move this out of the way. I'm basically using the lines on my grid paper as a visual reference. So I'm imagining that the line is coming across my greeting like this. Now when I mount it to my block, I also want to make sure, so it's centered on my block, but I want to align my block with the lines on the grid paper as well. So I'm paying attention to the bottom edge of my block and this grid line here. Now the reason for doing this is making sure your stamp is mounted straight on your block and that your block is straight. Because when it's a little bit wonky, it can really throw you off when you're trying to stamp. The next thing I like to do is draw a line on my cardstock. Now you heard me mention stamp positioning tool. It's so much easier when you're working with cling stamps to use some kind of a stamp positioning tool, but for the purposes of this video, I'm trying to keep it to the minimum number of supplies you have to get as a beginning card maker. But definitely one of the first tools I recommend you investing in once you have your basic supplies or your essential supplies is a stamp positioning tool. So I want to draw my line 1.5 inches down. So each of these squares on the inches side is 1/4 inch. So I'm basically counting down 6 lines and I'm aligning my graph ruler. So this is why, one, it's handy to have for it to be see-through so that you can see right through it and I can see its position, but I can also see where my line is going to be relative to where my image is. Now I'm going to take my pencil and I'm not applying any pressure at all. I'm just lightly dragging it across my cardstock. You don't want to apply pressure because otherwise it's very difficult to erase the line. It'll leave the impression on your cardstock. So now I'm going to ink up my stamp. So this is actually the most tricky part of your stamping, and I recommend actually if you're not using any kind of a stamp positioning tool, that this is one of the first things that you do. Now in this case I needed to position my greeting in reference to my branches, which is why it wasn't the very first thing, but I always recommend it's one of the first things and not the last if you're freehand stamping, because the worst thing is when you make a mistake and then you have to start everything all over again. So now as I hold my block, over my cardstock piece. I'm looking through my block to the line below, and I'm using that as a guide for where I'm stamping. Now, when you're doing this, you really have to get your head right above that block, and you have to look straight down. You cannot look down on an angle. Otherwise, your stamping will be off. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that, and then I'll be back. And I apologize in advance if my head gets in the way. Once you're happy with your placement, you then press straight down, apply light pressure, and lift straight up. And that's pretty darn good. Now, I'm not going to erase my pencil line right away because the cardstock we're working on, Whisper White cardstock, this is an ultra smooth cardstock, so it gives you beautiful results when stamping, but some inks can take a little bit longer to dry than other inks, and this black one happens to be one of them. Although I could probably run my hand over this and it wouldn't smear, if I were to take my eraser and run it over it, it would smear. So now what we're going to do is we're going to set this aside and we're going to work on our flower. So for my flower, I'm going to be stamping it in Melon Mambo Classic ink, and I want one for the outside and one for the inside. So I'm going to ink up my stamp. I want to make sure this is well inked. I'm going to stamp it once, apply my light pressure, got a nice impression there, and I'm going to ink it up a second time, and I'm going to stamp it a second time. Now, again, remember when I was talking about the black ink, I mentioned to you how we're working on ultra smooth cardstock, so some ink can take a little bit longer to dry. Because we're going to be going over this with an ink blending technique, and we're going to be kind of applying light pressure and rubbing, if this ink is not perfectly dry, there's the potential for it to smear. And I don't want that to happen because of course then I'd have to start all over again. So I recommend that you give it a few minutes to dry. Now if you have a hair dryer or you happen to own a heat tool, then you can use that to speed up the drying process. Now, in order to make this a little bit more manageable to work with, I'm just going to take my paper snips and I'm just going to very roughly cut these out of my cardstock piece like so. So now what we want to do is add color, and I'm going to be using these little makeup blending brushes. And I tried to choose a size that was appropriate to the image that I'm coloring. Hence this tiny one for the center, and then this larger one for the rest of the flower. Now, with these brushes, you don't have to clean them after every single use, as in like with soap and water, although after an evening of stamping, I will usually do that so that they're fresh and ready the next day. But while you're working with them, you can just kind of rub them on your cardstock to get rid of it, or on your grid paper to get rid of as much color as you possibly can. Now, if you can afford to, one of the things that's nice about this, like if you can get a set of brushes that you can allocate towards different colors, that's very helpful. You don't have to wash it as often. But if you can't, then just wash it at the end of each card making session. So I'm going to start with my Flirty Flamingo ink, and I'm just going to press this against the ink. Now, because I've just pressed it against the ink pad and it's fresh, if I were to just put it right on my petals, I'd end up with this big smear of ink on there, and I don't want that. So I usually will blot it once onto my grid paper, and then I will start off my image and then working in a light circular motion, because you can see even here how it's much darker. I will start bringing that color all around the petals of my image. Now, I don't want to really bring it into the center because I'm planning on adding another color, so you can see I've left a little bit of white there. I'm now rotating my paper just to make it easier to work with, re-inking my ink blending tool, touching it off, and then starting off my paper and lightly blending. Now, when you're blending with this, the handle there's some flexibility to it. I'm holding it a little bit further down. I don't want to hold it too close because I want there to be a little bit of give as I'm blending, because if there's not enough give, you can end up with not as smooth of an ink blend. So there you can see I now have my lightest color, This might have just a little bit too much white. So I'm going to get rid of that. This is my Flirty Flamingo. Now it's my Melon Mambo. Now the deeper the ink color you're working with, the more you have to be careful that you don't end up with ink smears or big globs of your ink color. So I'm going to touch my blending brush, then I'm going to pounce off, and now I'm going to bring this color on, and I want to focus the Melon Mambo more to the bottom of the petals to give it a little bit more shading than the top of the petals. Now, one thing that it's important to know when you're doing an ink blending technique like this, you don't have a lot of control. This is, you have to be prepared for happy accidents, and you can't expect perfection each time. You can't even really precisely expect it to go exactly where you want it. But that's the beauty of this technique. It gives a much more much softer, kind of artsy feel to your images. If you want to deepen the color, it's much better to add layers. So don't ever skip the blotting off part, and don't ever skip starting off the image, because you'll get a much smoother layer of color if you build it up slowly. So you can see for the most part, I'm just focusing along the bottom of both of these flowers. I want their, although I can't perfectly control where it's darker as much as possible, I want it to be darker along the bottom. And that is good. And then I'm just cleaning off my brush as much as I can. So now I've got my Melon Mambo, and I've got this little brush. You can see it has a little bit of a pointier end, so it allows you to get in more than, let's say, if the brush was flat. And I'm going to dip it on my Melon Mambo. Now this one I'm not actually pouncing off. I'm pouncing it on the middle of my flower because I want that concentrated color to be in the middle. And then without applying too much pressure, I'm going to blend that color more so to the top, but just a little bit on the tips of these bottom petals, like so. But you can see here why it's helpful to have these brushes in different sizes, because you wouldn't be able to get this kind of control if you were working with a larger brush. There you go, see? That was pretty fast. So now that we have our color, we're going to be fussy cutting out our image. So when I'm fussy cutting, the first thing I like to do is I like to get as close around the image as I possibly can. That just makes it a lot easier. Now, there's two things to know when you're fussy cutting. First of all, you want a shorter blade pair of scissors. So you don't want scissors that have a big long blade because you don't have a lot of control. A blade like this, you have a lot more control. It's helpful if it comes to a fine point. These are actually not my best paper snips. My kids got their hands on these, so I don't know if you can see the tip doesn't even come to an end, but I'm not sure where my good ones are. Hopefully they didn't find them. When you're cutting, it's easier to cut towards the inside of the blade. So as I'm holding this, I'm cutting with this part of the blade, and one of the things, pay attention to my hand, you'll notice that my hand position is fairly stationary. So, and that brings me to the next tip. In order to get a nice clean cut, it's the paper you want to move, not the scissors. So you don't want to be trying to cut like this. As you're cutting, you want to be rotating your paper. So here we go. You can see I'm in the inside of my scissors, and it's small cuts. Now, you can leave a border around it if you want, but in this case, and one of the reasons I actually fussy cut is because I like to be able to get right close to my image. Fussy cutting, I mean, you have to have patience to do this because, of course, it does take time to do. The more you do it, the easier it will be. Why would you do it? Well, I know these days a lot of stamp sets have coordinating dies, but in this particular case, the die set that coordinates with this stamp set is actually labels. It's not to die cut the images. So there are no dies that go with the images. Now, sometimes even when there are die sets that go with a particular stamp set and that allow you, and they have dies that actually match the images that allow you to die cut the images out, I still sometimes choose not to get the die set or to use it if I do have it, simply because usually when you're die cutting, you end up with this little border around your image, and I don't always want that border. Of course, the final reason too that I fussy cut is that, again, this video is geared towards beginning stampers and card makers, and die cutting machines are expensive. They're usually somewhere close to anywhere between $150 to $200, and that's a pretty significant investment, and you're already buying all your other supplies to get started, so you may not be in a position to invest in a die cutting machine. So that's why it's helpful to fussy cut. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to finish cutting this one out, and then I'll be back and we will continue our card. Okay, I'm done fussy cutting my flowers, and we're now ready to assemble our card. So I'm going to start with this panel here, and I'm going to take one of my flowers, and I actually like this one better, so that's going to be on the front of my card. And I'm going to take my Stampin' Dimensionals, and these are a double-sided adhesive. So when I peel it off the backing sheet, that side is sticky, and then I peel the backing off to reveal the adhesive on the other side. So it's a double-sided foam adhesive. And then I'm going to carefully place it onto my cardstock piece. Now, as long as you don't press down firmly, you do have the ability, as you can see here, to move it. Now, once you press your dimensionals down, it's a lot harder to adjust their position. I'm thinking trying to decide if I want my flower straight or on a little bit of an angle. I think I'm going to leave it like that. Then I press it down. Now for this flower, I don't want to give it dimension because it's going to be on the inside of my card. So I'm going to take my liquid glue and I'm just going to squeeze a little bit. And I like to squeeze it in the center because that way if it squishes when I stick it down, it doesn't squish out beyond the edges of my flower. And then the other advantage too is if I only have glue in the center, because the liquid glue doesn't dry right away, you have a little bit of working time. So you see here I can fiddle with the position of my flower before the glue completely sets. Now, because the glue does take a little bit of time to set, not long, like it's, I don't know, maybe a minute or whatever, you just want to be careful that before you continue working with this piece, you set it aside and give the glue a chance to dry. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick my main panel, my main stamped panel, to this black cardstock mat. And again, this is another reason I like working with liquid glue, because it gives me the ability to shift my piece a little bit if I don't get it perfectly straight. If you use like a tape runner, which is very popular in the card making world, once you stick your piece down, it's a lot harder to adjust if you didn't get it on quite straight. You kind of have to pull it apart and really hope that you don't rip your cardstock piece. Now let's take this one. I'm going to look at my card. I always like to pick the nicest side for what shows. So like if I had, like a little blot or smear or whatever, I can hide it underneath this panel. Whoops. There, see, I accidentally got glue there. So that is now going to become the inside of my card. As I apply my glue, I'm leaving a border, of course, because I'm sticking my panel to the inside of my card, like so. And then I'm going to do the same for the front of my card. Try to align it so that it's even. Now my ink has had plenty of time to dry, so I can go ahead and erase the pencil line. Now this is why I like this little eraser, because even though theoretically I could take an eraser to erase across it, I don't like doing that, just in case. So I'll take this and I will very lightly start to erase. And then I try, as I'm getting near the letters, not to actually go on the letters themselves as much as possible. I'm trying to avoid them. And I'm just trying to erase the pencil in between the letters, like so. And then if you have any kind of a paintbrush or anything like that, use that to brush the pencil or the eraser shavings away. I prefer not to get my hands on my card just in case I have messy fingers. So my final step is going to be to embellish with some clear rhinestones. Now I have rhinestones in 3 different sizes, the small, the medium, the large. This is Stampin' Up's old packaging for their Jewel's Basic rhinestones. Now they don't have these strips here, they just have small, medium, large, but I have so many of these ones left, I'm using these ones up. So I usually like to put a little rhinestone on my flower, and then I'm just going to add a little cluster, of rhinestones around my flower. And this is why I like my fine tip tweezers, because as you can see, I can just carefully nudge my rhinestone off my backing here and place it on my card. And when I place it on my card, so these rhinestones have an adhesive on the back, but I'm not pressing the adhesive down yet. I'm just essentially laying it on my cardstock, and that way, if I need to adjust the placement, I can. So I always use more little rhinestones than big rhinestones. I have a fluff on here. Oh, it's stuck to my rhinestone. Let's get another one. Usually I'll put 1 big rhinestone, 1 or 2 medium, and then the rest will be small. And then once I'm happy with the placement, I just press them down, and then that way they're stuck to my card. Now if you want to, I suppose you could put a rhinestone on the inside, but I don't, because in that, when you close your card, that can create an indentation in your cardstock. So I'll generally leave this like this, or you could add a little glitter, like a little sparkle, using this Wink of Stella brush pen, but I'm just going to leave this as is. So there you have it. We created this Just Saying Hello card. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial and that you found some useful tips, tricks, and techniques that you can apply into your own stamping and card making. Thanks for stamping with me, and I'll see you next time.